In this project, we are going to start learning some security features and user management, user account features in MariaDB and MySQL. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is, you can see I have all my VMs stopped in my Google Cloud. I am going to create a new machine. I've already done it here. I called it instance one. I just used the default. But you want to create just a default instance of your of Debian that we're going to use as a client to access our machine. So in order to really kind of play with some of these features and these tools, we don't want to just be logging into our VM locally. And even when you use MySQL Workbench, right, which we've used before, when you use MySQL Workbench, in most cases we're setting up MySQL Workbench to use SSL, right? So, or SSH rather. So we're SSHing into our server. So it's almost like we're logged in locally, and we want to play with some of these features without being logged in locally to our MariaDB server. So first thing I'm going to ask you to do is create a new machine. I just kept mine and called it instance one. It's just the default in Google. You can call it whatever you want. Make sure you know the root password for the machine, although you could probably use your default Google account as well, because we don't really need to use a specific user account in that VM. I just want you to have a machine that you can use to SSH to your server, but I want it to be behind the Google firewall, right? We don't want to just open port 3306, which is the MariaDB and MySQL port, out to the wide open internet. There's a lot of reasons we probably don't want to do that. We don't want to get into that. Although you could if you want to, right? You could go into the Google firewall and you could open up port 3306 to the wider internet if you like, but and avoid the need to build your own virtual machine. But the second thing you want to do after you have that machine built is you also want to take, if you recall from project one, I asked you to make a snapshot of your MariaDB server. So here's my machine, Info366A. That's my initial machine that I built in the video for project one. And in project two, I want to start with the snapshot. Instead of just using this machine, I'm going to create I'm going to use the snapshot that I created to create a machine for project two. And that's what I'm going to start with. So that way, if I need to go back to my original machine, I can always go back if I need to that original snapshot. And then when we're done, we're going to make a snapshot for project two. That way we have it. So we have a record of what we did up to project two. So to do that, you're going to create a new VM instance. And I think I showed you how to do this before, but just in case, I'll walk you through the steps to create a machine from a snapshot. Sometimes Google Cloud takes a second to load. Let's see what's going on here. Let me try refreshing my screen. Oh, whoops, I lost my connection to the internet, which happens sometimes. So let me connect to the internet again. There we go. And now if I refresh, we should be at the screen where we're going to create a new system. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to call it info-366- project 2. All right, so for the machine type, I'm going to do micro. I always do micro for my labs because we don't need a lot of space. For the boot disk, you're going to change this, and it's going to be a snapshot, and you're going to select your Info366 snapshot that you took during project 1. I'm going to click on select. That's all I need, and it's that easy. So I should have a working machine here in just a minute or two. You can see I got the little thing swirling around here, trying to create it. So it'll take a minute or two. In the meantime, I'm going to start up my my other machine, this instance 1. So now I should have 2 machines that are trying to start. If I go up here, I can see it's trying to start both my Info366 Project 2 and my generic instance 1, which I'm going to be using as a client. And once these are started, as we do the lab, I have 2 PowerShells open. The one on the top is how I'm going to SSH into my lab machine, and the one at the bottom, that's going to be my MariaDB server, and the one at the bottom is going to be my generic client, instance 1. So the top one is Info366 Project 2 machine, which we're going to be doing most of the work, and then the one on the bottom is how we're going to test it from our generic instance. One thing is, for that generic instance, you may need to install the MySQL client for it to work, and for some of this stuff to work. So I would recommend running apt-get to install the MySQL client. If you install MySQL Server on that generic instance, it'll work fine because it'll install the client tools as well. So let's go back to Google and see if my machine has been spun up yet. And it looks like it has, right? So I've got two machines here ready to go. So I'm going to connect to this one first. So let me come over here. We're going to SSH. I'm going to connect as student. And I have a problem here, right? So I want to tell you about this problem because this happens when you start and stop these machines a lot. So because I start and stop these machines a lot, sometimes my IP addresses get swapped around, right? So I kind of have to, yeah, I think Google is using the same pool of IP addresses for my machines, and every once in a while I get the same one from another machine, right? So when I try to log in, it says that my SSH token has changed, and it's preventing me from being the victim of a man-in-the-middle attack. And we're talking about security in this unit, so it's kind of interesting this pops up, right? So I'm going to show you how to mitigate that. So what you want to do is in your machine, the machine that you're trying to connect from, right? This is on my Windows machine from which I'm running PowerShell. In my user's home directory in Windows, I've got this folder called .ssh, and in there is a file called known hosts. And when you open that file, I'm going to show you what it looks like. You've got all these records in here, right? If I just clear these out, right? So if I just delete everything in this file, so there's nothing left in here, and I try to connect again, it's going to think I'm connecting to this machine for the first time. So let's give it a second. I don't know why it timed out the first time. My internet's a little wonky tonight, but it just thinks I'm connecting the first time. So I'm just going to type yes, put in my password, and I'm in. And just like we usually do, I'm going to type SU to get in as root. It's just a little bit easier because we don't have to worry about whether we're in root or not. And I'm in. So now I'm connected. And I'm just going to hit enter a few times to make sure you can see my prompt. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my other machine. So this is going to be my client down here. So we're going to copy that. And I use the same account name. I just did student. And I'm connected. And I don't have to run as root there because we're not really going to do much in that machine except test things to see if they work or not, right? Okay, so now that I'm connected, now we can start doing our lab, right? So let's, and before I get too deep in the lab, there is something I wanted to show you. There we go. So this tab I have open in Chrome. It has a list of account management SQL commands. So a lot of these SQL commands I'm going to talk about, and I think I put a link to this in the course in Blackboard as well. This is a good resource to learn about user account management. That's really what we're going to be looking at here in this project. We're going to be looking at user account management and how to streamline that, and some of the tools that we have available to us in MariaDB. And these tools are very similar in other database engines. They're pretty common across almost all database engines. They work very similar. In fact, a lot of these commands will work in just about any database engine: create, user alter, user drop, user grant, and so forth. A lot of those work very similar. So this is a good resource to get a little bit of background about this. The textbook also covers this material, and that's what I based the slide deck on in the lecture portion of the unit. But I just wanted you to be aware that that's here, and it's a great resource. And the URL, if you can't see it in the video, it's mariadb.com/KB, which stands for knowledge base, /EN, which is short for English, /library, /account management SQL commands. And that'll bring up this list of all of these user management commands that we're going to be looking at in this unit. So back to our machine. So the first thing I want to do, we've already, we've created our machine. So I'm going to take a look at the user accounts that we have. So I'm going to log in as root to my SQL server, and it's the one that has our college scorecard database that we recovered from that backup file last week. All right, I'm in. So first, if I want to take a look at my user accounts, a nice shorthand way to do that, we're going to do select. I want to see the host, the user account name, what's the value for password. We can't usually, it's usually hash, so we're not going to see a real password, but we can at least see that there's one there. And I'm also going to show the plugin, and we'll talk more about what that looks like later in this lab, or in this practical assignment. And that's going to be in the mysql.user database. So if I take a look at that, I only have two user accounts in here. I've got a root, which is on localhost, and that's using Unix socket for the plugin, which I wanted to show you. And what Unix socket means is that it's going to use the user account that I'm currently logged in to try to authenticate. And then I also have root that can connect to 127.0.0.1. And for that account, you have to use the password. There's no plugin, so you have to plug in that password. So that means I should be able to log in if I connect to localhost. I should be able to log into my database without having to put a password in because it's using Unix sockets. And we'll try that again in a little bit. And by default, that's how my MariaDB and MySQL work. When you first install it, you always have a root account that's localhost with a using the Unix socket plugin so that you can access the database without knowing a password. And you can always change that later on, like we did previously. But for right now, what I'd like to do is create a user account, and I'm just going to make it generic. I'm going to call it B Smith, but I'd like to ask you to use a different account name so that when you turn this in, there's something unique about it, right? Make it your own. So we're going to create a new user, and again, mine's going to be B Smith. I don't know, maybe it's Bob Smith, right? I'm just making something up here, and that user is going to be identified by their password. And I'm just going to type in password, right? Just to keep it simple. All right, so this should be a regular user account. It's B Smith, right? Now take a look at what the difference here. I'm gonna select my list of user accounts again, and notice that now I have B Smith listed, and for the host, it's a %, meaning it doesn't care who the host is. So this is kind of a catch-all. Now I could define a different password for different host names, meaning that if this user account was logging in from IP address 10.something.something.something, right, some other IP address or some other host name, that it would force them to use a different mechanism to log in. So for example, for the root account, root can only log in either from localhost or from 127.0.0.1. And for those who don't remember from your networking classes, that's the local loopback. So it's always going to be the local machine. And for the one that's connecting to 127.0.0.1, you have to put a password in. For the other one, as we learned in the lecture, Unix socket is the plugin where it uses your Unix account to access the server. On the other hand, B Smith, I don't care where they're logging in. They can log in from anywhere, meaning that down here, I should be able to connect to the server using that B Smith account, right? Now, the thing is, I don't know what the IP address of the machine is, so I'm going to look in Google real quick. So according to Google, my database server is 10.128.0.7. So that is the host name I need to connect to. So at the bottom, I'm going to add a -h, which is going to be 10.0. Oh, I forgot already. Sorry. That's the wrong. Let me just close that so I don't keep bringing up the wrong one. 10.0 or 10.128.0.7. So 128.0.7, and the username is going to be B Smith, and I want to make sure I pass a password. Now, what should happen here is this should fail. Can't connect to MySQL on that IP address. You should see the same thing when you try this on your machines. If you haven't done anything yet, you haven't fixed this already. Some of you may have gone in and fixed this if you've used MySQL or MariaDB before. But we have to configure our server to allow remote connections, right? It's an important part of this lab. So in order to allow these remote connections to MySQL, we have to make some configuration changes. And I'm going to show you where that is. So let's take a look at the config file. We're going to have to get out of this. We have to get out of MySQL. So we're back to the command prompt. Most configuration files in Linux are going to be in the etc directory, which this is no different, right? So we're going to go into etc. And if I show the contents of etc, you're going to see that there is a folder for MariaDB. And I know it's a little bit hard to see it this way. I had to Google the syntax. Is a little slightly easier way to look at just the directories in the etc directory. It's ls-d for directory, and then I thought you could just do ls-d, but you have to do the asterisk / I forgot about that. But in any event, this is a list of all the directories in etc, and the directory I'm interested in is this one right here that says MySQL, right? So let's go in that directory. So we're going to cd into MySQL because that's probably where our config files are. And if we look at that, we've got a couple different things here, right? And if I look at my.conf, we'll start with that. So if I just if I use the vi command to look at my.cnf, here's the contents of my.cnf, and notice what it tells me right at the top. So In MySQL, which most administrators are probably familiar with if they haven't used MariaDB a lot yet, they would go right to the my.cnf because that's where the config files typically were for MySQL. But you can see here that it tells us that most of your configs are going to be under mariadb.cnf, which is this file. There's a soft link to this file actually from MariaDB. So if you look at mariadb.cnf, it actually soft links to this file. And then you have conf.d, which is the directory of configuration files. Then you have this other one, which is a directory of configuration files. So that's going to be mariadb.conf.d. And then you have the my.conf, which is going to be in specific user directories, right? So in my own user directory, I can make my own configuration file for my own options for when I'm using MySQL, right, or MariaDB. So we know that most of our configuration settings are going to be in one of these 4 directories, right? So I'm going to tell you how I would take a look at this. So I'm going to hit escape, colon, and then Q to quit. That gets me back to my command line. So I'm going to first try and look at conf.d and see what's in here. So I have a mysql.cnf. So let's see what's in that. It's bi mysql.cnf. There's nothing in here, right? So let's get out of that. So there's not going to be anything of use in this directory. So I'm going to type cd ... to go back to the root, look at my list again, mariaconf.d, right? That's probably where my config files are. So if I cd into mariaconf.d, I've got a couple files in here. I've got MySQL D safe, I've got clients, my client configuration, and server configuration. Chances are what I'm looking for is going to be a server configuration. So I'm going to take a look at that file. So 50-server.conf. This looks pretty promising, right? So here's a bunch of configurations for MySQL Server. Now notice right here where it says bind address, this is actually my problem, is that if I bind to 127.0.0.1, that means when my server starts up, it is always going to bind to 127.0.0.1, and it will never bind to any other IP address, right? So that means I can only connect to MySQL or MariaDB if I'm using 127.0.0.1, which incidentally localhost always points to 127.0.0.1. It's the local loopback from your networking class, so if you remember that. But so this is what I have to fix in order to connect to my machine. And there's actually 2 ways we could go about this. So one method is that we could put the right IP address here, right? We could put, instead of 127.0.0.1, I could put the actual IP address, but then I'm not going to be able to use my local loopback, right? Another option is I could put 0.0.0.0, which means just bind to everything, right? So then it'll bind to 127.0.0.1 and any other IP addresses that it finds. So those are 2 easy solutions. Another one that you could do is I think if you just type skip binding, that'll actually tell it not to bother even looking at IP addresses. It'll just bind to anything, right? It doesn't care. It's agnostic. So I think this is going to work. So we're going to, W is to write, Q is to quit. Let's see what happens here. So in order to try this, systemctl, restart, MariaDB. Give it a second to restart. All right, failed because there was an error. And I bet you the error is because I screwed up the syntax on this file that we changed. So let's just take a look real quick. So skip binding might not be the right option. So it might be going off of memory here. Oh, whoops. Let's try skip bind address. So try that one. Hey, that worked. It was able to restart. So I think that was a valid configuration option, which means down here at the bottom, I should be able to connect. Hey, I'm in. All right, so I'm connected, right, using my bsmith account. So with my bsmith account, I now have access to MariaDB. One problem though, normally the first thing you do is you try to use a database, right? So that's the first step, and it's going to tell me that access denied for my user account to the college scorecard database. It's saying you're not allowed. No one's given you permission to do that. So our next step is to configure our user account that we created to have access to that database. And the easy way to do that is going to be the grant command. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to type grant all privileges. Oh, I tell it on what? On college scorecard dot star. Now, if you remember in the lecture, I think I talked about this, that when you grant privileges, it can be to an entire database, right? Which in this case is college scorecard. But if I just type college scorecard without the dot star, it's basically saying you have privileges to the college scorecard database, but nothing inside that database, right? So you could say use college scorecard, but you won't be able to do anything because you have to have permission to all the objects that are within the schema for college scorecard. So by adding the dot star, it's basically saying grant all privileges on college scorecard dot star, right? Which means dot everything that exists in college scorecard. And if I put a table name in there, it would grant all privileges to that specific table rather than to the entire database. And I would have to do that for each table that I want to give access to. And we're going to try that here in a few minutes. But for right now, I'd like you to just give permission to everything, and let's just try and make sure it works. Whoops, I have to click in here again. Oh, did I lose my internet connection again? Yeah, sorry, I lost my connection, so I have to reconnect to my database. I think I'll pause the video next time this happens because I periodically lose connection to my database. All right, so I'm connected as root again. So we are going to grant all privileges to college scorecard dot star to B Smith. One thing I forgot though, it's on, not to, right? So grant all privileges on college scorecard to B Smith. So that's going to give B Smith access to everything. Okay, so they should have access to all of everything that's in my college scorecard database, right? Pretty straightforward. So at the bottom, I'm going to connect to my database again because I lost my access down here. And again, it's because my internet connection drops out sometimes, thanks to Verizon. And I think the host was 10.128.0.7. Username is going to be B Smith, and we want to provide a password. And we're in. All right. My database has changed. If I type show tables, I can see a list of all the tables, and it looks pretty good, right? I'm connected. I can even probably do select star from school. I'm going to do a limit because otherwise we'll get inundated with records here. But I get a couple records, right? So it works. So I'm able to connect. I'm able to select. I can do whatever I need to. So let's go back up here and try something else. So now that I've granted permission, you know, with the show command, we can show lots of stuff, right? If I type show grants, it's going to show me the grants for whoever I'm currently logged in as, which is root, right? But I want to see the permissions that I've delegated to this B Smith account that I created. So I'm going to type B Smith for B Smith. And it tells me that I've granted B Smith privileges on everything in college scorecard, right? So they're allowed to log into the database, right? That's what grant usage means. They can log in and use the database. And then I gave them all privileges to College Scorecard. But I want to back that off a little bit. So how do I get rid of that permission so we can try this, slightly different? And the way I'm going to do that is revoke. So I'm going to revoke all privileges. And you always have to, after you do this, and grant option from B Smith. This should just get rid of everything for B Smith, right? So now B Smith can do nothing. And and by the way, once you make a change like that, it's a good idea to flush the privileges. And now from down here, I think this is still going to work, right? It still lets me because I still have this session. So if I exit and then I reconnect to my session, now if I try to use College Scorecard again, it gives me an access denied. So now we can try to be a little bit more granular. I can give just certain permissions to this College Scorecard database to this particular user. So first, I'm going to give them permission to use the database. So I'm going to grant all privileges on College Scorecard to B Smith. Now notice I left off the dot asterisk, right? So I have no database selected, right? So it's not going to let me give permissions to just the the database name if I don't provide some other criteria, right? So what I'm going to have to do is I'm just going to have to give them permission to a certain table, right? So I could do College Scorecard, grant all permissions to College Scorecard dot school to B Smith. Now down here, if I wanted to, now I still can't use College Score. Oh, I can use still college. Yeah. Sometimes I think in older versions of MariaDB, you can't actually use the database. You have to use the full name if you don't have permission to all the objects. But it looks like it works here. In fact, if I type show tables, it should only show me the tables that I have access to, which for right now should only be one table, right? I only have access to one table, school. But I could still do that select statement, right? So I could select star from school, limit to 2 records, right? And that works fine. Now the problem is, let's say this user account is not supposed to be able to change the school records. They can only look at these records, right? If you took Info 365, for this particular project with the College Scorecard database, the whole scenario was that we have like a department of underwriters that are making decisions on student loans based on research they're doing in this database. So we want to make sure that not just anybody can go in and make changes to this data, right? Because it's kind of important. They're using it to make these big decisions about these college student loans and stuff. So what I'm going to do is revoke all privileges again, right? So now we have no privileges. I'm going to log out down here. That way I can create a new session after we do this. And now instead of granting all privileges to College Scorecard, I'm just going to grant select. So now I should only be able to select from College Scorecard and not do any updates, right? Or any deletes or anything like that. So if I come down here and I log back in, so I can use College Scorecard. Oh, I forgot I have to use the right case. Oh, it's not letting me do that. So like I said, sometimes you have to flush privileges. And I bet I'll be able to select even though I can't change the database. There we go. So I can still select it, but I can't change to that database for whatever reason, which is okay. And I think actually you could fix that if you grant permission just to the database. Yep, it looks like you can't do that in this version. All right, so now I can select, but let's see if I can do an update. So for example, this one, the first record is the OPEID, and the first one is 100200. So let me see if I can delete that. So I'm going to delete from school, where OPEID equals, oh, I have to add the database name here. There we go. Delete command denied for my user account, right? So I can't go in and edit these records. If I tried to do an insert statement or a delete statement or an update statement, it's going to fail unless I go and add those permissions, right? And if you don't remember what permissions this particular user has, I can do show grants for B. Smith, and it tells me that the only thing I've granted permission for this user is to select collegescorecard.school, right? And B. Smith. So that works. So the next thing I want to do is let's say I have a scenario where this particular group of users, this is a pretty big database. It's got a lot of tables, right? So if I do a show tables, I have to just to show you, because you may not remember, right? We did this before, but if you look at all the tables, there's a lot of tables, 42 tables in this database, and some other objects as well. There's even some views and things like that might be in this database. But maybe I only want users to have access to certain objects in this database, which means I can do grant statements for all the things that I want them to be able to do, right? Which is great. But the problem here is that let's say I had 100 users, I would have to go and do these grant statements for all 100 users to grant it per user, right? That's not scalable. It's a lot of work, right? So we want to have a way to consolidate this, right? So that our user accounts have um, our user accounts can be managed in as a group, right? Which is pretty common for most IT type systems, right? We usually want to do some kind of delegation to groups, and we want to have permissions we can set at the group level. So we could do the same thing here. So first, let's do the scenario where we decide on a couple tables. So what I want to do is give access to the school, religious affiliation, admissions, academics, the locale and region, because maybe this particular group of people only needs that information, and then they need some information about the users for the API. But a special case there for the API is I may not want them to have access to the password, right, to the API key. Like maybe for whatever reason, they should be able to see who people are that might be able to log into the system, but they shouldn't have access to the more sensitive information about their login key. So let me show you how to do that. So first, the easy one. We've already done this, right? We were able to grant permission to these tables. And we can just do select permissions on all these, right? Let's pretend this is a read-only user and they're just doing some research. They don't need to do updates, inserts, and deletes and so forth. So the first thing I need to do is create a role that we're going to use to manage all this. So we're going to use create role, and you have to give the role a name. I'm going to use CSC user for mine, for college scorecard user, right? That's just my shorthand, but you can call this whatever you want. In fact, I would encourage you to use a different label for this. So I'm going to make sure there's an admin for this, and really I'm just going to use the current user, which is really just root, right? I'm logged in as the database root right now. So that should just make me the admin for that role. All right, so now I have this role called CSC user. Now, when I create privileges, I'm going to create those privileges for a particular role as opposed to a user. So it's the exact same syntax. So for example, I can grant select on, and if you remember, I wanted to use a school, right? College scorecard. You have to spell it right though. So school is the first table, and I'm just going to grant that to CSC underscore user. All right, and the other table that I wanted to do, so we've got school, the other one was going to be religious affiliation, and then I also wanted, let's see, we wanted admissions, and then I also wanted academics. the locale, and the region code. And of course, the other one we wanted was the API information, right? So we had API user details. That was the first one. Now they can access anything they want there. Oops, is it called something? Oh, it's users details. Maybe not. API users details. I thought that was the name of the table. Oh, I think it's just user detail. Sorry about that. It's API users detail. It's always the little things, right? So the last one I want to give access to is the API users table, right? But like I said, there's a couple of columns in there that are kind of sensitive. So I only want them to be able to access the ID, the user ID, and the username. The rest of those columns, like the API key and the API password, I don't want them to be able to access that stuff. So this should only give them access to select those specific columns. All right, so that's basically everything I need for my role. Now coming back down here, I'm going to flush I'm going to get rid of all the permissions on that user account again. So let's revoke all user or revoke all privileges. Then we're going to do a flush again. I'm going to come down here and try to do a select. It's going to tell me that it's denied for my user account, right? Because my user doesn't have permission to do selects. I can't even use college scorecard, right? It should tell me access is denied, right? So to fix that, right? So I know this user account, this B Smith user no longer has access to anything. So I'm going to use a grant statement to put that user into that role. So we're going to grant CSC underscore user to B Smith. And what we're basically saying here is make the B Smith user part of that CSC user role. So now anything that you see our CSC user has access to, B Smith is going to inherit all of those permissions without me having to go in and do this individually for that particular account. There's one other thing I can do is I can set that role to be automatically applied when the user logs in. Uh-oh, I think I just lost my internet again. So I'm probably going to get disconnected here and have to reconnect. So let me pause this for a minute until I reconnect. All right, so I'm reconnected. What I was going to show you is that we can set the default for the role, right? So I can set default role CSC underscore user for B Smith. So now when B Smith logs in, they should automatically get that role and not have to set that role. Because you could be a member of lots of different roles. And then you can change which role you're operating as, right? You could say, okay, right now I want all the permissions for role 1. And then when I'm doing some work for role 1, I'm going to switch to role 2 and then do some stuff with role 2, right? That's the basic idea. But when you log in, you don't have a role. So to make this just easier, we're going to set the default role for when they log in. This doesn't work in all versions of MySQL or MariaDB, so I don't know if it works in 10.1, but we'll give it a shot. So I'm going to reconnect to the server again here at the bottom using my B Smith account and put my password in, which is just password, right? So now if I try to use, college scorecard, all right, I'm in. And we're going to show tables. Oops, I forgot the semicolon. And look at that. We have just a short list of tables here. It's only the tables that we provided access to. It's academics, admissions, locale, region, religious affiliation in school. Then I have the API users and users detail. But if you recall, if I try to select all, right? So if I try to select star from API users, it should give me an error saying that access is denied, right? But if you recall, I gave access to just certain fields. So if I do ID and username, for example, it shows it to me. It's only when I try to put a field in. So star says get me everything in that table, but I only gave access to certain columns. So that works, right? It denied me access to those sensitive columns, but when I provided just columns I have access to, it worked perfectly fine. And again, if I try to do updates or deletes on these tables, it's going to fail because I only have the select permissions. So we've got all that stuff figured out, right? So here's the next step is we're using MariaDB to manage our user accounts right now. It's the most basic type of authentication where, and again, I'll show you with our select statement here. So we have this B Smith user and it's authenticated by a password. And I know that it's being managed by this password, which is a hash, right? That's not the real password. That's a hash of the password. Hopefully you remember something about that from your Linux classes, right? Or your security classes when we talk about hashing. We don't actually store passwords in plain text, right? But there's no plugin assigned for this user account, right? The plugin field is blank, which means the only thing that it could possibly be using for authentication is going to be a password. And of course, I could tell this is a role because number one, there's no password. Number two, there's no plugin, right? Because roles don't really have passwords and plugins. So, I know that that's a role. And I can look at the permissions on that role, right? So if I do show grants, I forget what I did with that role. I can see that it has access to all those tables, which I showed you before. And I can actually, if I look at B Smith, right, I can see that B Smith has access to the CSC user, right, the college scorecard user role, which is right up here at the top. That's how I know that they're in that role. So this is how an administrator might try to figure out, what roles does this user account have, and then look at the role to see what permissions they have. And this is really not as complicated as something like Active Directory, right? So if you look at Active Directory and how it handles roles and group policy and all that stuff, and you probably learned about that in one of your Windows classes. That could get really complicated. This is significantly simpler than that, right? A little bit easier to manage. But again, it's a little bit convoluted in how you have to trace all this when you're working with the server. But in any event, now that I have all this figured out, the next leap that I have to make is how do I prevent from having to manage user accounts in the database itself? And we're kind of leading you down a path here of where the database administrator doesn't really want to have to administer all the user accounts in the entire organization. That's someone else's job, like the person who manages Active Directory, for example, right? So the first thing I want to show you is how we can use Unix accounts to do this. So my first step, let me exit out of my MySQL. And I'm going to create a group called CSE for College Scorecard, right? And this is just basic Unix commands, right? So hopefully you learned all this in your Unix class at some point, or your Linux class. So I'm going to create a group called CSE. That group is now created. I am going to create 2 user accounts in my Unix system. I'm going to call one. So I'm just going to name my user accounts off of streets that I used to live on, right? I used to live on a street called Gristmill, so I'll use that one. And after that, I lived on a street called Morton, so I'll use that one. And I live on a road called Hopewell now, so I'll use that one, right? Easy peasy. So we're going to do user add dash A, or I'm sorry, just user add, my fault. So user add, and the first one is going to be Gristmill. And then user add, the second one is going to be Morton. And actually, I should probably show you the right way to do this. If you do add user, it asks you some questions, right? So it lets me set up a password. And then it has me put the name in. I'm just going to skip the rest of the questions and say yes. And then I'm going to do the same thing for Hopewell. And again, this is a better way to add the user account than just user add. Okay, so now I've got my user accounts. I've got Morton and Hopewell, right, are my 2 main user accounts. I made a Gristmill one too, but I'm not sure it's going to work because it didn't create the, and I'll show you what I mean by that. If I look at the contents of home, I have Hopewell and Morton, but I'm missing Gristmill because I didn't use the right command, right? I used user add instead of add user. Add user actually creates the directory structure, and it does a bunch of other things that we need when we create a new user, right? But it doesn't do that when you use the user add, and it also creates a password too, which we need, right? If we don't have a password, then now I could set a password, right? So if you do passwd gristmill, I can put a password in, and I'm just making mine password. But you can make the passwords anything you want, but you have to remember what the password is because you're going to have to log in with these accounts. All right, so now that I've done that, we already have our CSC group. Now I have to put all these user accounts into these groups. So user mod -A, and really this is kind of an optional step. We're not really gonna need this, but I want to do it just to show you that you can do this, because I'm going to talk about it later. So we're going to add Gristmill, Morton, and Hopewell. So we're going to add those into the CSC group. So now I've got the CSC group. It's got a bunch of people in it, right? And I could log in as those users if I wanted to. Okay, so we've got that figured out. So I've got user accounts, they're in a group, they have passwords, all of that makes sense. So we're good to go. So let's move forward. So now we're going to go back into the database. Somewhere in my history here. There we go. All right, so we're back in the database. Now I have to do some configuration within the database. So we're going to create a user, and we're going to use the same name. I'm going to do Gristmill first. So we're going to create a user called Gristmill. But one difference here, instead of identified, using a password, make sure I spelled that right, identified. All right, I keep spelling stuff wrong. We're going to type the via keyword and tell it to use the Unix socket, meaning basically identify this user based on the Unix socket that they're logging into the database from. An important distinction here is that this user will only be able to access the database from a valid Unix socket on the same machine, which means if they're logged in somewhere else, it's not going to work. But we're going to talk about that next. So I'm going to start with this, and then we'll cover this in the next section. So we're going to add Hopewell, and then we're going to add Morton. All right, so again, we talked about this before, but it's not enough just to create the user. We also have to grant them access. But instead of granting access to everything, or creating all those permissions that we created before, I'm going to give them that role that we created. So it's going to be the CSC user role for Gristmill. Oh, whoops. Sorry, it's to Gristmill. There we go. So we want to do Gristmill, then I want to do Morton, and we're going to do Hopewell. All right, so that's done. The last thing I want to do is set the default role, just so I don't have to type it over and over again. So we're going to set default role CSC underscore user for Gristmill. I'm going to do the same thing for Morton, and then the same thing for Hopewell. All right, so now that account is created. They have access to certain things, right? So this should work. So I'm going to exit. Now, remember, I have to do this from the same machine. But now, instead of connecting to MySQL as root, I'm going to try to connect as Gristmill. Access denied. So let me try Morton. Access denied. So let me get back in as root. I think I have to flush the flush privileges for this to work. Oh, I'm forgetting a step. I'm sorry. We're logged in as root right now, right? So what I actually have to do is I have to back all the way out, and I have to SSH in as the user account that I'm trying to use, right? So the user account that I set up, let's try Gristmill. That's the first one I used. And it looks like it's going to time out, so I might have lost my internet connection again. Let's see if it times out. So I don't know why, but I keep losing my internet connection. It keeps timing out. I just restarted my internet. Let's see if it works. Hey, I'm in. Okay, so now I'm connected as, and I'll just prove it, right? Who am I? I'm Gristmill right now. So if I just type MySQL without anything else, I'm logged in as Gristmill, right? So I didn't type -u for username. I didn't type any other information. I just said, just try to log in, right? Um, so it used my Unix account to try to connect me. So now I'm connected to the database. And if I try to use college scorecard, oh, wait a minute. I think I need a capital C and a capital S. Access denied. That's weird. Let's see if we can do a select statement. Oh, I forgot the E in scorecard. Sorry. There we go. And if I show tables, I should just see that short list of tables, and I do. And if I try to do an insert statement, it would fail, right? All that stuff should work as if I'm in that role. So again, I logged in as Gristmill. Now let's try it as a different user. I'm going to log in this time to my SSH session. I'm going to use, let's try Morton, right? And I just made my password really secure, right? Notice that because I used the right command to create the user account, it's a little bit different now, right? Now I see some additional information in here, but in any event, if I try to connect with MySQL, I'm in, use college scorecard, show tables, same thing, works fine, right? So now I can basically, what this means is that as the MariaDB DBA, as long as these users, when I set it to Unix socket, if a user decides to change their own password in Unix, right? If they have a Unix session and they run the password command and change their password and how they access the Unix server, implicitly it's going to change how they access. They're still going to have access to MariaDB. I don't have to worry about their password in MariaDB, which is great. Um, so that's the first thing, right? We could use Unix socket accounts, but here's the problem, right? Is down here at the bottom, I have to reconnect to my server because I got disconnected. So let me just reconnect real quick. Okay, so down here, if I try to do MySQL-U Gristmill as an example, right, which is one of the accounts that I created, and I try to put my password in, I don't even know I'm putting the real one in. It's not going to work. It says access denied, right? Because it's only going to allow them to log in from localhost, and it has to be Unix socket. So it's not going to work. So that means this only helps me for users that actually have a valid Linux session, right? They're connecting from a valid Linux session. Well, if it's an application, that's not going to help me, right? Application. So if I have applications that access the database, I'm still going to have a MariaDB account for an application. It's going to have a hard-coded password. So the application also has to have the password in their application or in some config file for the application. And if I periodically have to change it, it has to be modified in both places. There's got to be a better way to do this, right? So the next option is PAM. So I'm going to show you an example of how to use PAM with MariaDB. And what exactly is PAM, I'm going to show you. So if I look at, we looked at this before. If we go into Etsy, oh crap, I'm still logged in the database, sorry. And I got to get in as a super user. All right, so now I'm logged in as root. And if I change directory to Etsy, I've got a list of a whole bunch of stuff in here, right? But what I'm interested in right now is PAM. So I'm going to look in pam.d. And assuming I did that right, you've got a bunch of stuff in here. So basically, PAM is the common user management platform. It's basically POSIX user management. So all Unix systems, whether it's Linux or Unix or BSD or FreeBSD or OpenBSD and all these different platforms, they all work very similar with user management. And PAM is the standardization that allows different applications to use the Unix login mechanism out of band, right? So all these different things. So you recognize some of these things, right? So SSHD uses PAM. That's why when you log in with SSH, your Unix account or your Linux account works with SSH. You don't have a separate SSH account. And if you change your password in Linux, SSH understands that and allows you to still log in. And how does that work? There should be a file in here, vi/etsy/shadow. I don't know if it's going to let me take a look at this, but this is here it is. So this is the password file for Linux, right? So all the different user accounts that I have configured are going to have an entry in here in in the, yeah, you can see here I got BCG28. So there's my student account. And there's the hash for the password for the student account. And there's Gristmill, Morton, Hopewell, right? So everything I need to authenticate a user exists here in Shadow. So in theory, if I have an application that has access to the Shadow password file, they should be able to authenticate a user because we know what this hash is, right? We know how this hash is created. We know the algorithm. We know what the salt is. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, this is all from IT security type courses. But I should be able to authenticate users directly instead of having to use like a Unix socket, for example, which is the other plugin. So if we could somehow do this, um, we can allow login from other applications. We can allow login from another machine without having to be on the same Unix system. So it opens up some interesting things that we could do. So let me get out of this before I mess up my file. I'm just going to do Q exclamation point to get out of this. So I could probably create an additional profile here for MariaDB. In fact, I'll show you how to do that. I think to use PAM to create a different, you could create another profile in here. So what would that look like? So we're going to create a new file. It's going to be VI, since we're already in this directory, we're just going to call it MariaDB, right? So we're going to create a new PAM file called MariaDB. There's nothing in here yet. So we're just going to put some stuff in here. So, and I'm not entirely sure what has to be in here, but we're going to give this a try. So authorization required, PAM underscore Unix dot so with audit. And then we'll also, you also have to do account is required. With audit. I think that's all we need. Oh, crap. I hate it when it does this. I have to delete. I don't know why VI does this sometimes. There we go. So now if I take a look at the contents of this, I now have a profile for PAM or for POSIX compliant authentication, or the POSIX authentication module, I think is what it stands for. But at least I think that's what it stands for, but I could be wrong. I now have a MariaDB profile in here that I could use if I wanted to, right? Although I could just use the default. So that should work, right? I should be able to configure MariaDB to allow access to the server. So how do I do this? So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into MariaDB. So MySQL -u. Actually, I think that should just let me in. Yeah, because I'm logged in as root, so it lets me right in because it's a Unix socket, right? So if I show, or if I actually have to do a select, get all the way back to my select statement. All right, so I've got my Gristmill, Hopewell, and Morton users that are all using Unix socket, but I want to get rid of those, right? Because now we're not going to use the Unix socket, so we're going to drop user Gristmill. Oh, I spelled Gristmill wrong. Sorry. I'm typing too fast. I did it 2 times in a row. Good grief. All right, so drop Gristmill. We're going to drop Morton, and we're going to drop Hopewell. So now those users are all gone. Just going to validate it for us, right? So we don't see them anymore, but my role is still there, which is good because we're going to need that. So now we're going to add these users back in. Now, before we do that, if we want to use PAM, we have to make sure it's installed first. So to do that, we have to install that module. So you have to type install so name, and it's auth underscore PAM. At least I think that's what it is. There we go. So now we should be able to use auth PAM. It's installed by default with MariaDB, so it should be there automatically. You don't have to download any libraries. So I'm just using a base install of MariaDB on my server, and it works. So I should think this should work for you as well without having to install any additional software. So next, I got to create my user accounts again. And I think, oh, whoops, I got to go up here. So we're gonna. Oh, I think I lost my internet again. Let me reconnect. I don't know why this, yeah, there it goes. I paused the video so you didn't have to watch me reconnecting again, but so I have to create my user, right? So create user, we'll start with Gristmill again. Actually, I'm going to start with Morton this time because I don't remember if Gristmill, I think we created without the home directory, which might affect this. So we'll use Gristmill, identified via PAM, right? So this time the user is going to be identified with PAM as opposed to being identified with a Unix socket. So now I've got my user account. So next I'm going to grant CSC user to Morton. And I'm going to set default role. Let's see, you gotta remember default role CSC underscore user for Morton. So now they should get that role by default. So I'm kind of recreating all this, but now they're being identified via PAM as opposed to Unix socket. Could you just do this by updating that user table? I think you can. I think you could just do an update on user and set their authentication module to PAM instead of Unix socket, and I think it would actually work, right? So you could, in theory, do that. All right, so what else do I need to do for this user account? I created the account, I gave them access. So now I should be able to try to use Unix authentication from a remote machine, right? So I'm going to connect in again. Now I'm connected to this remote machine on the bottom. I am connected using, so if I type who am I, right? I'm definitely connected as student, but this time I'm going to run MySQL minus U Morton minus P because I need to give it a password. It's going to ask me to enter a password. Access denied from Morton at localhost. And I think I had this problem before where I knew I set up PAM the right way, but it didn't give me access to the database using PAM. And I think the reason for that is, remember I showed you that shadow file, right? I showed you the shadow file and how the application could read it, but I think what's happening is MySQL has to go and read that shadow file. So I have to give permission to MySQL to access the shadow file in order to carry out this authentication. So first thing I need to do is, usually by default, you already have a shadow group. Just to show you, right? I'm going to try to, oh, sorry, I have to exit out of MySQL to do all this. So we're going to do group add, shadow. I should already have a shadow group, right? It already exists, so I know that I just have to work with that group. So the first thing I need to do is user mod. So we're going to change, we're going to add shadow, the shadow group. So we're going to take, and you saw me use the user mod command before. This is how I add a user to a group. So I'm going to add MySQL, which is the account that's used to run MariaDB, to the shadow group. So now MySQL is a member of shadow. And then I'm going to make sure that the ownership of shadow is extended to this group, just to be sure. It probably already is, but it doesn't help to do it again, right? It doesn't hurt to do it again. And I'm also going to make sure that the that group, right, this that the group that I just created has access to Etsy shadow. So they can do a read or write. The whole group can do read from that. So now anybody in the shadow group is able to read that shadow file, which includes the MySQL user account, which is what's running the database. So when you try to log in using MySQL, MySQL is what's the credentials of the MySQL service account in Linux is what's being passed through to the shadow file. And if that account doesn't have access to the shadow file, it won't work. Now, some versions of PAM, I think the way it works is it's an API call as opposed to a direct read from the shadow file. So it authenticates the account that's accessing the shadow file is actually PAM and not the software, whatnot, the service is trying to do that authentication. So it's a little bit cleaner when you do it that way. But I think whatever version we have of PAM on here may not be that version. So just to try it, let's try this. So I'm going to log back into my SQL. I'm going to try using that same password. And I still get access denied. So let me double check. So one step I think we might have to do is restart the server after we made all these changes. We're just going to do a complete restart of the server. And the easiest way to do a restart on your server is to do it in Google. You could do it, a shutdown, but I think it's a little bit easier to do it here in Google. So I'm going to go in here, and we are going to, I'll just stop the machine first, just to make sure we get a clean shutdown. And in case you're wondering on the status, because it doesn't do a very good job of telling you here, if you click on this little bell in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that it's stopping your machine. So this sometimes takes a little time. I think it gives the machine something like 90 seconds to try to shut itself down, and then it'll automatically shut it down. It'll do a hard stop. All right, so I know the machine is stopped now because the little bell tells me, right? It says that it just stopped. So I have to hit F5 to refresh this. Although I probably lost my internet again. Let's connect again. And usually Chrome figures out that you're reconnected. Okay, so now it shows the machine is turned off. I'm going to click the little button and tell it to start it back up. And I can tell it's starting because I got the little thing spinning around here in my notifications. All right, so it looks like my machine has now restarted, right? It shows me in notifications that it's done. So I should be able to go back and log into my machine again. Let me bring up my Unix sessions again. Oh, you know what? I got to check and make sure my IP didn't change. So sometimes when you restart these, so this is 3467.47.237. Let me see if it's the same. Nope, it changed. All right, so let me go and copy that to my clipboard. So make sure you always check to see if these IPs change. There is an option to keep the same IP, but they charge you a little extra money when you're running your machine if you have a static IP. Actually, I think they always charge you. I think it's like a recurring fee, which is why I don't keep it the same. I'm trying to keep my machines dirt cheap. And instead of logging in as Morton, I'm going to go back to using student. So it's like I'm logging in for the first time, right? Because it's a new IP address. All right, so I'm logged in. Let me check the local IP as well. So it's still .7 for the local IP, which means I don't have to change anything in the client. So if I come back, let me bring both these back up again. So now I'm going to try to connect to the client again. All right, so now I'm connected from the client, and I'm just going to clear the screen first so that we start with a fresh screen. All right, so now if you recall, it's been a couple minutes, right? So let me bring it up again. So we're going to connect as root. Get into my MySQL server, show my user accounts. Got to go back a ways here. There it is. All right, so there's my Morton account, and it's using PAM for the authorization plugin, which means down here I should be able to access using the username Morton, right? And notice there's no password or anything, right? So this is going to try to use PAM to log in, and I'm connected. Show my tables. There they are. It's my finite list of tables. It's all based on those permissions that I assigned. So now I could do the same thing. I could add my gristmill account. I could add my Hopewell account. I could add as all the accounts I want. And I don't have this in the lab, but one thing I want to talk about is that PAM supports user mapping as well from MySQL, or from MariaDB. So what we could do is we could create a generic account in MariaDB that is authenticated by PAM, such that anytime somebody tries to log into the database, they can log in with a Unix account. It will get, or any account that's supported by PAM. So here's the neat thing is PAM doesn't just, PAM works with LDAP. So what we could do, so think about this for a second. If I take PAM, right now it's authenticating against that shadow password file, but in theory, Linux can also do authentication against an LDAP server. LDAP is supported by Active Directory, which means that I could, by proxy, I could probably have my MariaDB accounts authenticated by LDAP through Windows Active Directory, which means that as a SQL administrator, as a MySQL administrator or a MariaDB administrator, I don't really care about user accounts at all, other than the fact that I make sure that different groups in Active Directory have the right permissions in my database. So what you could do is you could map roles in MariaDB to groups in Active Directory such that when a user is authenticated by LDAP, and if they're a member of a certain group, they'll have access to certain roles within MariaDB, and then they have the right permissions. So if it's a certain kind of user, they'll have access to the right tables, and if they happen to be in the DBA group, then they have access to all the, to all privileges in the database and so forth. And in that way, I never have to manage user accounts. They can all be managed by LDAP through Active Directory, which is where that management belongs, right? So if somebody leaves the company and their user account gets deleted, I don't have to worry about that in MariaDB. I don't even have accounts in MariaDB anymore. It's all managed by LDAP. So having this flexibility really opens the door for a lot of a much easier administration of the database engine. And this isn't just something that MariaDB supports. This is what almost all major database engines, including all the NoSQL, Mongo, and Couch, a lot of these different database engines, Cassandra, a lot of them support LDAP, which, infers that it also supports Active Directory as the source of truth for user accounts. So it's pretty useful to be able to do this. All right, so that's this part of the of project 2. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.